Welcome, this is Jim, host of the Faith Influencer podcast, where we're going to dive into discussions on faith's role in everyday life, from navigating blended families to overcoming challenges. I'm a husband, a father, a Bible teacher, an advocate for applying faith to everyday life. So tune in as I share personal stories, valuable insights, and practical wisdom. Welcome back to Faith Influencer. This is Jim Cunningham. I'm having fun because we're talking about money. Money is one of those issues in blended family that's a little different than in first marriages. So the last podcast, part one, we laid the foundation for this. We started talking about some of the practical issues in blended families and in second marriages with money. And our first question was, should we combine our money? Should we combine our money, our accounts? And my answer was yes. That's my preference, because the foundation of marriage is the husband and wife relationship. And it's strange to me, the idea that we want to combine our children and everything else, but not our money. Now, remember, I said that was my preference. There are some situations that are a little different. So now I want to give you when we should not combine our money, or how we are to handle it a little differently. And let me set this up by sharing a story that I was having with a gentleman in my office. And basically, this is what he said. He had been remarried and he has no children. His wife, when they remarried, has 2 children. Her children, however, when they got married, were college age, and now they're out of the house and grown. This is literally what he said to me. He said, if my wife dies before I do, her kids will not get 1 red penny. That's what he said to me. I was a little shocked by how brazen he was, that her kids, his stepchildren, would receive nothing. But I'm going to say that's something that some of you are concerned about. You're concerned about, if something happens to me, will my kids get anything? How will my kids get some of my inheritance if it's all left to him? So there are some different situations where we need to realize maybe you need a separate account for this, or maybe you don't combine your money in this situation. So let's walk through those today, and I'm looking forward to your feedback. So as we walk through this, here's my question. When should we not combine our money? What are some of the exceptions? And there are some. What are some of the exceptions, and how do we handle those? So let's be very practical, and I'm going to dig a little deeper into some financial principles that I normally don't do, but I'm going to do it in this podcast because it's necessary. So you have a blended family. Your kids, they have their kids, you have your new spouse. You want to make sure that your children, should something happen to you, that your children also receive an inheritance, are blessed. You don't want them to be left out. So if a spouse is concerned about that, the best way, the cheapest way, the initial way that you're to handle that is simply with life insurance. Now, this is not a discussion about selling life insurance. This is a discussion about how you handle some financial things and make sure that some things are passed down to your children. That's the easy way to do it. I'm going to tell you how my wife and I handle that. But it's the easy fix where you take out life insurance and your beneficiaries are your children. Or here's how my wife and I did it. When we got married, my children were older. They were college age. Her children were younger. Her children were still being raised. So we took out a life policy on my wife because her children were still being raised. Mine were not. We took out a life policy on my wife, and we made her ex-husband, this was a discussion that we had with him, we made her ex-husband 50% beneficiary. So if something happened to my wife, on this policy, he would get 50% of it designated for him to continue to raise the children. It strictly went to the kids. This was for the kids, but he had to be the beneficiary because you can't put a juvenile child as a beneficiary on a life policy. So he had to be the beneficiary, and she knew in this scenario that the money would go to raising the kids. So he was 50% beneficiary, and I was the other half of the beneficiary. And then he agreed. We took out a life policy on him. He's the owner of that policy. 50% of that policy, same thing, would go to my wife, his ex-wife, to help raise the children should something happen to him. So that's how life insurance took care of that. Now, here's how it's set up. Once her children, and now they're about there because we're 15 years in, once the children are raised, then we'll remove her ex-husband as 50% beneficiary, and I'll become 100% beneficiary on the life policy, or the children will take over that 50% of the beneficiary because now they're of an age where they could be listed as a beneficiary. So does that make sense? So that's one way to handle it with your life insurance, to make sure that your children are blessed should something happen to you. If you can't make those kind of an agreement with your ex because you don't trust them or you're not sure what they would do with the money, then you just do it on your own. You just take out a life policy and you designate your children, but you're going to have to bring in a trust. And I told you we're going to dig into some stuff I normally don't. So let me mention that in just a moment. That's how my wife and I handle it. So what if you enter into a second marriage with assets? Now, this is going to be the exception. So you have a second marriage, you've brought children together, and you're bringing in assets. I oftentimes work in this scenario. Maybe it's an inheritance that's been passed down through generations. Maybe it's a family business that has been passed down, and the intention is for you to take over this generational business, and then you pass it to your children. And that's the intention. And that was all set up before you remarried. But now you've remarried and you have stepchildren. What's the rule of thumb? The rule of thumb is that it's okay that you're not sharing this with your stepchildren. This happened before you ever remarried. This was meant for you and then for your children. So there's no issue that what you brought in by way of generational assets or inheritances or trusts or any of that, that's not then automatically shared with your stepchildren. If you want to do that and your family agrees to that and you bring them in on that, that's fine. But if you don't, that's fine. That's the alternative here that I want you to know. That happens a lot. You may have a grandparent who said, I'm going to pay for my grandchildren's college. And they've built college funds for your kids. And now you've remarried. Do you need to divide those college funds with your stepchildren? No, not at all. There's no pressure there. You should feel no guilt for not doing that. Grandparents set that up for your children. And even though your stepchildren may not have college funds, this was set up prior to you getting together. So there's no issue there. That's the rule of thumb. So don't feel any guilt in that area. But now let's go a little step further. We're digging in, as I said, to some of these financial principles because that's a background that I have. So it's easy for me to talk about this. What happens if you and your new spouse are driving down the road and let's say the Lord says it's time for you to go home? Unfortunately, there's a car wreck or something and you and your spouse are taken. What happens to all of your assets? What happens to everything that you have? What happens to the house? What happens to everything? How are the children to deal with this? Well, I'm going to say that it shouldn't surprise you that in most cases, if the children are grown, especially, they're going to fight over this. That's just what happens. I experienced that in my own family. My grandmother, who at this time was single, but my grandmother, when she passed away, she had no directives at all for all that she had. She had things that had been passed down from her parents. And I mean, all these things that were of great value to me, but she had given no directives. After the funeral, I had to disappear because of work for 4 or 5 days. When I got back, her house had been raided. All the cousins, people you hadn't seen, everybody came in, was grabbing stuff, taking stuff, valuable stuff, stuff that I would have treasured, but there was no directives as to how any of that would be divided. What happens with the stuff, I know it's just stuff, but what happens with the stuff is that they tend to fight over it. So what do you do? How do you deal with this? Especially if you've brought an inheritance or assets into the marriage, or maybe you're creating assets. Listen, this is what you have to do. You have to understand a will and a trust. But I'm going to tell you, I know we're getting technical here, but it's important. You have to understand there's a difference between a will and a trust. A will is a directive, but it still has to go through probate, and probate lasts forever and it's very expensive. The only difference between a will and a trust is that a trust doesn't go through probate. So get a trust. It's more expensive, but do it. Put a trust together, and in that trust, you describe how you want all of the assets to be divided. So if the Lord says to you and your spouse, it's time for you to go home, and they take you home, and he takes you home, there's no discussion, no arguments, no anything amongst the children because you decided beforehand. Please understand how valuable that is. So you take all of the inheritance for your children, even if it's something that you brought into the marriage that doesn't necessarily go to the stepchildren. In the trust, you spell all of this out. You need a trust attorney. Don't go online and do this. You need a trust attorney to help you outline all of this. Spell it out exactly how you want it to be distributed. Now, you may say with the house, you may say, okay, maybe both of you have children who are grown and you want the house sold and divided equally. Well, just put that in a trust. How you want it to be done, you do it. Why? Because this protects everybody. This protects the children. This is what you must, especially in a blended family, when you have two sets of children who may want to go different directions. This is how you do it. If you don't, mark it down. You're setting your family up, your children and your spouse's children, you're setting them up for family fights. This is where it comes from. Avoid all of this. Make sure that you put a trust together. Now, I'm going to throw a couple more technical things at you just to conclude this, because I want you to put these in place so that you don't have these family money issues. Here's the next one maybe you haven't thought about. Beneficiary designations. Beneficiary designations. I had a man who came to me so upset because his wife, who worked, passed away. And something they never thought about was that her 401k at work still had her ex-husband as the beneficiary. They never thought about it. She died. The ex-husband was the beneficiary to her 401k. That did not go over well. Beneficiary designations are important. So make sure you change all of those. And let me tell you how important it is. Do you know that if you do what I suggested earlier on the life insurance, the beneficiary designation on the life insurance trumps even a trust? As a matter of fact, on life insurance, you do not even have to put your life insurance in a trust because it has a beneficiary designation. And that is the one rule they will always follow, who you've listed as the beneficiaries. So don't overlook the beneficiary designations. And if you had previous life insurance that probably listed your ex, then you need to go and change those. You can only do that if you're the owner of the policy, but you need to change those beneficiary designations. So that causes some heartache if you don't do that. And then the last thing is healthcare directives. And what I'm talking about is powers of attorney. So here's what happens. You're in an accident and you're unconscious and you need emergency surgery. Who can make that decision? No one, unless they have the power of attorney. What if it's life-threatening? Well, they'll probably do the surgery, but legally, your spouse would have to go to a judge and get the power of attorney to be able to come back and make the decision, yes, give them this surgery. So you have to have power of attorney. But where it gets sticky is in the financial piece of the power of attorney. You realize that if you have separate accounts, and this is, remember the statistic on blended families, on second marriages, only 37% of them have joint accounts. Rest of them have separate accounts. You know what happens? You're in an accident, you're unconscious, and you can't make financial decisions for a while. Who can tap into your account? No one. No one. Unless they have power of attorney. So if you have separate accounts, practical wisdom is when you're doing a trust, your attorney's going to designate some powers of attorney. Be sure that your spouse has, or a grown child has, the power of attorney over your financial accounts, because otherwise no one can tap into them. So I said that my preference is that you join your money, and then I'm laying out some alternatives. So let me close with two different testimonies from couples as to how they handled theirs. Here's the first couple. It was the lady describing how they went on a trip. I think you'd find this helpful. She said she had children, her husband had children, they blended their family, now they're going to Disney. She said he paid for his ticket and his kids' tickets. I paid for my ticket and my kids' tickets. When we got to Disney, we split the lodging. We split the meals. And this is how we handled the children. We gave each one of the kids a gift card with the same amount on the gift card. And this was their card to use for snacks while we're at Disney and souvenirs. That's how we divided. It was equitable. We agreed on it, and it caused no issues at all. I really like that. That's a great way to handle that if you're going to somewhat divide your accounts. Here's the other one. Another couple said that we put all of our money together from day one. What's mine is his. This is a lady giving this testimony. What's mine is his, and what's his is mine. And we both provide for each other's children. All big purchases, she said, are discussed first, but we spend whatever we want to on day-to-day things, and that works for them. So there are different scenarios, no exact rule of thumb. You have the preferences from the previous podcast, and we'll continue this discussion, but send me questions that you have that we haven't addressed. I'd love to address those. Please like and share this. Thank you again for joining Faith Influencer.